My family forced me to live as my disabled brother so they could collect his benefits. The social worker looked at my medical files for the third time, her forehead creasing with confusion. David, according to your records, you had a severe peanut allergy last year, but you just ate a PB&J sandwich without any reaction. I sat frozen in the chair, my heart hammering against my ribs, while Mom's hand tightened on my shoulder like a vice. 4 years of living as my dead twin brother, and this was how it would all unravel. One stupid sandwich that David could never have eaten without an EpiPen, and a trip to the emergency room. I watched the social worker's pen hover over her notepad, waiting for an explanation that would either save our lie or destroy everything. David died when we were 12, not from his autism or seizures like everyone believed, but from Mom and Dad's neglect during one of his meltdowns. They'd locked him in the basement to calm down and forgot about him for 18 hours in 90-degree heat with no water. I found him myself when I got home from my friend's house, unconscious on the concrete floor. By the time they finally called 911, it was too late. David's brain had swollen from dehydration and heat stroke. The doctor said he'd been dead for hours, his small body unable to survive the conditions my parents had trapped him in. They stood in the hospital hallway crying crocodile tears about their special needs son, while I knew the truth about what killed him. But David's disability checks were worth $2,400 a month, plus medical coverage, special education funding, and housing assistance that kept our family afloat. Dad had been laid off for 6 months. Mom worked part-time at a gas station making minimum wage, and we were facing eviction within the week. Losing David's benefits meant losing everything we had, so instead of reporting his death, they made me become him. Michael died in the same accident, Mom told the hospital staff, while I lay sedated in David's bed, wearing his clothes, surrounded by his stuffed animals and medical equipment. The lie came so easily that I wondered how long she'd been planning this moment. The funeral was for me, supposedly. Michael Cooper, age 12, beloved son and brother, taken too soon in a tragic accident. I watched from David's wheelchair as they buried an empty coffin with my name on it, while our relatives cried for the wrong child. Only my parents knew the truth about which twin was really dead. Social services accepted the story without question, too overwhelmed with other cases to investigate thoroughly. One twin was dead, one survived with his existing disabilities intact. The paperwork was straightforward, requiring only minor adjustments to medical records and benefit documentation. They even offered grief counseling for David's survivor trauma from losing his twin brother. The training began immediately after the funeral. Mom showed me hours of videos she'd recorded of David during his meltdowns, forcing me to practice his specific stims and repetitive behaviors. I learned to flap my hands the exact way he did, to rock back and forth at his precise rhythm, to cover my ears and make the keening sounds he'd made when overwhelmed. Dad drilled me on David's medical history with military precision. Every medication, every dosage, every side effect, every therapy session, every doctor's appointment, every emergency room visit from the past 5 years. He made me recite it like multiplication tables until I could answer any question about David's condition without hesitation or doubt. "If you mess this up, we're all homeless," he said, his voice cold with threat. "And you'll end up in foster care with people who won't understand your special needs like we do. They'll put you in institutions, Michael. They'll lock you away forever because you're too damaged to live with normal families." The threats worked because I was 12 years old and terrified of losing the only family I had left. I couldn't imagine surviving in foster care. Couldn't picture myself explaining to strangers that I wasn't actually disabled while my parents went to prison for benefit fraud and medical neglect that killed my brother. I learned to avoid eye contact, to speak in the stilted phrases David had used, to have meltdowns on command when situations became too challenging for him to handle. The performance had to be perfect because David's teachers, therapists, and doctors knew him intimately. Any inconsistency could expose the fraud and destroy our lives. The hardest part was the seizure medication that made me foggy and nauseous all the time. David had taken Keppra twice daily for his epilepsy, and Mom insisted it was necessary to maintain the medical records. "Doctors will be suspicious if David suddenly doesn't need his pills," she explained, while forcing the tablets down my throat every morning and night. The medication made everything harder. School became a struggle because I couldn't concentrate or remember simple information. My natural intelligence was suppressed by chemicals I didn't need, making me appear more authentically disabled while slowly poisoning my developing brain. I started having real seizures from the medication overdoses, which Mom claimed proved the treatment was working. Going to David's school was terrifying at first. His teachers and aides knew his patterns, his triggers, his capabilities better than anyone. Mrs. Brennan, his special education teacher, had worked with him for 3 years. She could spot behavioral changes that other people missed entirely. I spent weeks studying her old notes about David's progress, memorizing every detail of his educational journey. But grief explained away most of the differences people noticed. "He's been so changed since the accident," Mrs. Brennan said sympathetically during our first parent conference. "Losing his twin brother has affected him deeply. He seems more aware now, almost like he's trying to be both boys at once. The cruel irony was that my naturally neurotypical behavior looked like miraculous improvement to everyone around us. David had been non-speaking and severely limited in social interactions. My desperate attempts to appear normal while pretending to be disabled created what therapists called remarkable developmental progress following his trauma. I earned praise for achievements that were actually massive regressions from my real abilities. When I managed to tie David's shoes, they celebrated it as a breakthrough in fine motor skills. When I answered questions in complete sentences, they documented it as expressive language improvement. Every normal thing I did became evidence of David's recovery. Dr. Kessler, David's longtime psychiatrist, posed the biggest threat to our deception. He'd worked with David since age 6 and knew his patterns better than anyone else in the world. During our first appointment after the accident, he studied me with sharp eyes that seemed to see through every performance I'd practiced. "You seem different today, David," he said, leaning forward in his leather chair. "More present, more aware of your surroundings. Are you feeling better since we adjusted your medications?" I nodded and mumbled something about missing Michael, praying he'd attribute any changes to grief rather than recognizing that I was a completely different person. But Dr. Kessler wasn't satisfied with simple explanations. He prescribed new tests, brain scans, and comprehensive evaluations that made Mom visibly nervous during every appointment. "He's getting too curious," she muttered after each session. "Maybe we should find a different doctor who doesn't know David's history so well." However, switching psychiatrists would raise red flags with the benefits office, potentially triggering a thorough investigation into David's current condition. Any major changes to his treatment team would require justification and documentation that we couldn't provide without exposing inconsistencies in his medical history. The physical changes became harder to hide as I grew older and stronger. David had been smaller, frailer, with distinctive scars from childhood accidents and medical procedures. I was developing muscles he'd never had, growing taller than his projected height, displaying coordination and athletic ability that contradicted his documented motor delays. I had a birthmark on my left shoulder that David didn't have, and David had a surgical scar from a hernia repair that I lacked completely. These differences weren't noticeable in casual interactions, but medical examinations posed constant risks of discovery. Mom started limiting my doctor visits, claiming David's condition had stabilized and required less monitoring. Photos from before the accident became dangerous evidence that Mom tried to control carefully. Family albums showed clear differences between David and me that careful observers might notice. Our facial expressions, body language, and mannerisms were subtly different despite our identical genetics. Mom removed most pictures from common areas, claiming they were too painful reminders of our family tragedy. At 13, I was living multiple overlapping lies simultaneously. At home, I had to be Michael pretending to be David for the government benefits. At school and therapy, I was David recovering miraculously from trauma while secretly being Michael. The constant performance was fracturing my identity in ways that created real psychological damage. Sleep became impossible as I lay awake reviewing endless details of David's documented life. His favorite foods, his specific fears, his behavioral triggers, his developmental milestones. I memorized therapy notes going back years, studying videos of his sessions to perfect my imitation of his responses to various stimuli and interventions. But the more I learned about David's inner world, the more I realized how little I'd actually understood him when he was alive. We'd been identical twins sharing a bedroom, but his autism had made him a mystery to me. Now I was living inside that mystery, pretending to understand experiences I'd never actually had. Mom started giving me additional psychiatric medications to make my behavior more convincingly erratic and unpredictable. The antipsychotics made me drowsy, confused, and emotionally numb, which she claimed was necessary for maintaining authenticity in front of medical professionals who knew David's medication history. David was taking risperidone for behavioral issues, she insisted when I complained about the severe side effects. If you don't take exactly what he was prescribed, people will notice the difference immediately. These doctors aren't stupid, Michael. They know what to look for. I was being systematically drugged to maintain a performance that was slowly erasing my real personality. The medications affected everything about my daily functioning. My handwriting changed, becoming shaky and uncontrolled like David's had been. My speech patterns shifted, becoming slower and more deliberate. My emotional responses flattened, making it harder to react appropriately to social situations. I was becoming chemically similar to my dead brother, while losing myself in the process. School became increasingly difficult as the medications accumulated in my system. Subjects I'd previously mastered became confusing and overwhelming. Math problems I could solve easily became impossible puzzles that frustrated me to tears. My grades plummeted to match David's documented academic struggles, which everyone attributed to his grief and trauma recovery. Teachers praised my hard work and determination when I managed to complete assignments that should have been simple for someone my age. They didn't realize I was struggling with artificial cognitive impairment caused by medications meant to treat conditions I didn't have. Every small academic achievement became evidence of David's remarkable progress following tragedy. The breaking point came during a routine physical examination, when Dr. Patterson, our new family physician, noticed my appendectomy scar during a standard checkup. I'd had my appendix removed at 13, 2 years after David's death, but David's comprehensive medical records showed no such surgical procedure in his documented history. When did this operation happen? Dr. Patterson asked, running his finger along the healed incision on my lower abdomen. There's no record of appendectomy in your file, David. This is a significant surgical procedure that should be documented in your medical history. His voice carried professional concern, mixed with growing suspicion about the discrepancy. Mom's face went completely white as she scrambled desperately for a convincing explanation. It must have been during the accident recovery period, she said quickly, her voice higher than normal with stress. Maybe the records got mixed up with his brother Michael's files during the hospital chaos. You know how confusing that time was for our family. But Dr. Patterson was already pulling up David's digital medical records on his computer, scrolling through years of documented treatments and procedures. Electronic medical systems didn't simply lose major surgical procedures, and he knew enough about hospital record-keeping to recognize when something didn't add up properly. Mrs. Cooper, surgical procedures don't disappear from electronic medical records, he said carefully. And according to this file, David was never admitted to any hospital during the time period you're describing. These records are comprehensive and complete going back to his birth. His tone suggested he was documenting every word of our conversation for future reference. More inconsistencies emerged during the following weeks as Dr. Patterson ordered additional tests and examinations. Blood work revealed I didn't carry genetic markers for David's specific type of autism spectrum disorder. Vision tests showed I needed corrective lenses that David had never required in his documented medical history. Most damaging of all, my fingerprints didn't match the ones on file from David's previous medical procedures and disability evaluations. Fingerprints were routinely collected during certain evaluations to prevent benefit fraud, and the comparison results were undeniably conclusive. The boy sitting in the examination room was not the same person who'd been receiving disability benefits for the past 4 years. Dr. Patterson scheduled a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation with multiple specialists, claiming it was standard procedure for reviewing long-term disability cases in teenage patients. But I could see the suspicion building in his professional demeanor, the way he watched Mom's reactions to certain questions, and documented our responses with unusual thoroughness. He was building an investigation, gathering evidence for conclusions he couldn't yet voice officially. Every appointment became more tense as he asked increasingly specific questions about David's medical history, comparing current observations with documented past behaviors and responses. The net was closing around our deception systematically and methodically. The final crisis exploded when Dr. Melissa Chen, the new child psychologist brought in for David's evaluation, asked me directly about Michael during our session. I've been reading through your extensive medical files, she said gently, and I noticed some interesting discrepancies. Can you tell me what you remember about your brother Michael? I understand he died in the same accident that affected you. The question hit me like a physical blow, because no one was supposed to know David had ever had a twin brother. The official story had been carefully constructed to eliminate any mention of Michael Cooper's existence. Insurance papers, school enrollment records, medical histories, everything had been systematically altered to show David as an only child who'd survived a family tragedy. I don't know what you mean, I whispered, but my voice was shaking uncontrollably. Dr. Chen leaned forward with gentle professional concern, and I realized she'd been conducting her own investigation, digging into records that Mom and Dad thought they'd successfully hidden or destroyed over the years. Michael, it's okay, she said softly, using my real name for the first time in 4 years. I know who you really are. I know what your parents made you do. I've contacted the original hospital where David actually died, and I've seen the real medical records. You're safe now. You can tell me the truth. The flood of relief and terror that crashed over me was completely overwhelming. 4 years of living as a dead person, of chemically suppressing my real personality, of constantly performing grief for a brother whose identity I'd stolen, all of it collapsed in that single moment of recognition and acknowledgement. I broke down completely, sobbing and shaking as the truth poured out between desperate gasps for air. Dr. Chen recorded everything, asking gentle questions that helped me piece together the chronology of abuse and deception that had defined my teenage years. Every detail mattered for building the legal case that would follow. Dr. Chen had been investigating discrepancies in my medical records for weeks, contacting previous hospitals and cross-referencing documentation that revealed the elaborate fraud. She'd found original birth certificates showing twins, school enrollment records that contradicted the current narrative, and medical files that had been suspiciously altered after David's actual death. She'd also discovered that I'd been receiving psychiatric medications completely inappropriate for my actual mental health condition, essentially being systematically poisoned to maintain a performance that was destroying my psychological development. The medical abuse was as serious as the financial fraud, representing multiple felonies that carried severe penalties. The investigation moved quickly once medical and legal professionals became involved in documenting the case. Forensic experts confirmed through multiple methods that Michael Cooper had never died in any accident, while David Cooper had died from medical neglect during a psychiatric crisis that his parents had tried to cover up. Financial investigators traced exactly how much fraudulent benefit money had been collected over 4 years. The total exceeded $200,000 in disability payments, medical coverage, educational support, and housing assistance, all obtained through systematic identity theft and document fraud. Federal agencies became involved because of the scope and duration of the criminal activity. Mom and Dad were arrested simultaneously at home and at Mom's workplace, charged with multiple felonies including benefit fraud, child abuse, medical neglect resulting in death, identity theft, and forcing a minor to participate in ongoing criminal activity. The charges carried mandatory federal prison sentences that would separate them for decades. Their desperate attempt to avoid poverty had destroyed both their children and landed them in the federal prison system. David was dead from their neglect, I was psychologically damaged from years of forced impersonation, and they faced spending the rest of their lives behind bars for crimes that grew worse with each year of continued deception. The media attention was intense and horrifying for me personally. Local news stations ran sensational stories about the twin switch fraud that had fooled social services, medical professionals, and educators for years. Our childhood photos were broadcast side by side, showing subtle differences that investigators had missed during routine oversight. Former teachers, therapists, and doctors were interviewed about warning signs they should have recognized, turning our family tragedy into a cautionary tale about institutional failures and systematic oversight problems. I became a case study in abuse and fraud that would be referenced in professional training for years to come. I spent 6 weeks in specialized psychiatric care, detoxing from medications I'd never needed while processing 4 years of enforced psychological trauma. The medical team was amazed by how thoroughly my natural identity had been suppressed through chemical and psychological manipulation, creating genuine mental health problems while forcing me to fake ones I didn't have. Recovery meant relearning who I actually was underneath the performance I'd maintained for so long. Simple questions like, "What's your favorite color?" became existential crises because I couldn't distinguish between my genuine preferences and David's documented likes and dislikes that I'd memorized and performed for years. Foster care was initially challenging because I'd forgotten how to be myself authentically. Social workers had to help me rediscover my real personality, my actual interests and talents, the aspects of my identity that had been buried under years of medical records and disability documentation that belonged to my dead brother. The legal proceedings revealed the full scope of systematic fraud and abuse my parents had orchestrated. They'd methodically deleted evidence of my existence while building false narratives around David's survival. They'd coached me to lie to dozens of professionals, stolen hundreds of thousands in government benefits, and essentially murdered one son while psychologically destroying the other. But the most devastating revelation came during the sentencing hearing when prosecutors presented evidence showing David might have survived his medical crisis if my parents had called 911 immediately instead of trying to hide the incident. Their initial panic about losing benefits had directly caused David's death, and their subsequent cover-up had stolen my childhood and adolescence completely. The judge called it one of the most complex child abuse cases she'd encountered in 20 years on the bench. 2 children had been destroyed by the same parental greed and desperation. One was dead from neglect, the other was psychologically shattered from years of forced impersonation. The damage would affect multiple generations of our family. Mom received 12 years in federal prison. Dad got 15 years due to his role as the primary orchestrator of the fraud scheme. They would both serve their time in different facilities, prohibited from contacting each other or me for the duration of their sentences. Their marriage was effectively over, destroyed by the same crimes that had killed their children. 3 years later, I'm 18 and living independently with ongoing support from victim services programs and trauma specialists. I legally changed my name back to Michael Cooper, and am slowly rebuilding the identity that was stolen from me during my most formative teenage years. Every day is a process of rediscovering who I might have been. College feels overwhelming after years of artificial cognitive suppression, but I'm determined to develop the intellectual potential that was chemically restricted for so long. My brain is still recovering from years of inappropriate medication, but neuroplasticity gives me hope that I can reclaim most of what was lost during those crucial developmental years. I volunteer with organizations that help other victims of benefit fraud and identity theft, sharing my story to help professionals recognize warning signs they might miss. David deserved parents who saw him as more than a disability check, and I deserved the chance to grow up as myself rather than as his ghost.